everyone, and welcome back. This is a very exciting video for me. Today I'm joined by Ricky Clark, who you met a few weeks ago when he came to our class. As you may remember, he is a Ph.D. candidate at Columbia University in political science. He studies international organizations. Together, we actually wrote and published a paper on the World Bank, and he is an amazing co-author, and I'm just so excited that he is here to join us and to share his expertise on the World Bank and the IMF. He is writing a dissertation right now, which will eventually be an awesome book, on institutional proliferation and cooperation between institutions. So we're now moving into this section of the course where we've already unpacked who these IOs are, and now we want to see how they interact with each other. So welcome, Ricky. I am so glad to have you here today to share your expertise with us. And I guess just to start us off, I want to ask you, what exactly does institutional proliferation mean?
Thanks, Lindsay, and I'm really happy to be here. So when I talk about institutional proliferation, what I mean is that the number of international organizations that operate on the global stage has increased dramatically in recent years. This increase, of course, parallels the rise of states that might challenge sort of the US hegemony and US institutions like the IMF and World Bank. So the rise of states like India and China parallels this increase in the number of international organizations because they increasingly sponsor organizations that challenge these other institutions.
So why is it that international organizations proliferate?
It's a really good question. So the first organization in an issue space is typically created according to this logic that Cohen put forth, which all of you have probably read for this course. So the logic is that states need some way to credibly commit to policies that will increase general welfare. So they might have to tie their hands so that they don't defect in like a prisoner's dilemma framework. And institutions then can help member states generate net welfare gains on the whole. However, after that first organization exists in an issue space, a more political logic takes hold. So if there's an institution like the World Bank that's already generating these welfare gains, then the next development institution will typically challenge the monopoly or sort of the lack of competition held by an institution like the World Bank. So institutions are created by challenger organizations that hold different ideologies than leading stakeholders in existing organizations. For instance, at the World Bank, countries like Brazil and China don't have a lot of vote power, right? Their vote share lags those of countries like the United States or the European states, and therefore they might be dissatisfied with the status quo in existing institutions. They might also challenge the liberal conditions that are imposed by the IMF and World Bank. For instance, privatization or increasing free trade, create these competitor organizations that administer policies that are more close to their ideal points, right? And also they can create organizations that might lend to their allies in larger amounts and ultimately just reflect the policies that they'd prefer to see on the international stage.
So why should we care about IO proliferation?
Yeah, so basically the logic is that international organizations, if they're going to coerce these really difficult reforms, for instance, asking a government to privatize public corporations like the IMF does, that these changes have short-term costs that can be quite difficult for countries to undertake. For instance, you might have to fire people that were previously employed in the public sector. And then when private firms purchase these enterprises, they might cut wages, right? Because now the market is dictating the price that these employers are going to be paid. And so these adjustment costs can cause protests. Some of you might be familiar with the Greek case, for instance, where there's been a lot of protest over IMF conditions. And so in this situation, the logic is that if international organizations don't have a monopoly, right, if they're not the only organization in the issue space, then it's difficult for them to enforce these conditions. If there are more than one organization in the issue space, then member states of multiple organizations can try to select the least strict offer among a bunch of different organizations. So if you belong to the IMF and also a regional competitor institution for an American lending entity, the Latin American Reserve Fund, which awards balance of payments assistance to countries much like the IMF, a member of both institutions might have incentives to go to the Latin American fund first because it doesn't really impose these harsh conditions on member states. In that situation, for the IMF to impose these conditions. So essentially, proliferation might erode the ability of institutions like the IMF to enforce very difficult policies and coerce policy change among their members. And so it's important for international organizations to try to figure out some way to mitigate this problem, to prevent shopping among institutions in order to enforce policy.
So can IOs do anything about this?
Fortunately, they can, and this is exactly what my dissertation is about. So there are sort of two bundles of different strategies that institutions can undertake. Existing literatures focus on one approach, which I refer to as coordination. And so this is going to be international organizations specializing or trying to carve out a division of labor or some niche area over which they can recover a monopoly. So for instance, if the World Bank was bothered by competition with other development banks, maybe they decide that they'll just become the only institution that lends to some subset of countries, right? Or perhaps they'll try to change their activities so that they become the only organization lending in one area, like environmental loans. In this situation, the organizations are limiting the scope of their activities so that they're now recovering some degree of authority. And in that situation, they should again be able to enforce difficult reforms within whatever that small policy space is. However, you can imagine that this might be very costly for international organizations. We know that organizations generally want to expand their influence, not shrink it. We also know that leading member states in these institutions want more authority over member states, not less. And so changing the mandate or scope of activities can be very, very costly. Therefore, I argue that a more attractive strategy for international organizations might be what I call cooperation. And so this is just going to be a pooling of resources, expertise, and personnel among organizations to accomplish some joint task together. For instance, development organizations often co-finance projects in the developing world. An example would be if the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank build a bridge together in a country like Malaysia. In that situation, they're pooling resources and expertise to both design the bridge and then ultimately implement these programs in the target state. You might imagine that this could generate performance gains because each institution has areas of expertise that might be different from the other institution in the partnership. And so they can leverage these comparative advantages effectively. You might also imagine that a benefit in this situation is that essentially they're co-opting what would otherwise be an outside option, right? So if the Asian Development Bank is outside of the World Bank framework, then a country can threaten to take their business to the Asian Development Bank unless the World Bank gives it a better deal. But if the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank work together on the project, then a state can no longer threaten to take their business elsewhere. So in some sense, it's institutions co-opting each other so that they can implement this policy framework together in an effective way. As this graph shows, co-financing and also information sharing, so this is just going to be a pooling of resources on the one hand for co-financing and a pooling of information that would otherwise be private when we look at information sharing. Both of these forms of cooperative arrangements are increasing over time. And as I mentioned previously, it's increasing in unison with the increase in the number of organizations in these issue spaces. So this graph applies to the development and emergency lending issue spaces, so the IMF and World Bank's issue spaces, as well as the regional entities that govern alongside them. What we see is that cooperation is becoming more common. And this suggests to me that when we have overlap among activities, organizations recognize that cooperation is a way to effectively constrain state behavior, right, coerce policy change, despite the fact that there's overlap among these activities. So organizations as agents in the international economy can band together in order to mitigate what would otherwise be the negative consequences of overlap and proliferation among institutions.
So when can IOs cooperate and coordinate in practice?
Yeah, I argue in the book project that the driving factor when it comes to cooperation among these international organizations is geopolitical alignment among the major shareholders, major member states in these institutions. For instance, as this graph shows, looking at emergency lending international organizations, you can see that co-financing and information sharing among these organizations sort of accords with a geopolitical logic. The organizations that are more interconnected, in other words, they're pursuing more co-financing deals and information sharing arrangements. Each line drawn between institutions is a year of cooperation, and the thickness of the line is going to be the number of agreements that were signed by those organizations in a given year. What you can see is that the European institutions, so the European Union Balance of Payments arm, the European Financial Stabilization Mechanism, and the European Stability Mechanism, all three, are tightly interconnected with one another, which isn't surprising, right? They're all under the EU umbrella, but also they're very tightly connected to the International Monetary Fund when we look at co-financing. This is, I argue, because the preferences of leading European states like Germany and France on the one hand, and leading stakeholders in the International Monetary Fund on the other hand, like the United States, right? These preferences are very similar. And so we should expect staff from these organizations to want cooperation because there are high levels of trust and high levels of similarity in the preferences of policies that they would administer to member states. If we look at information sharing, we see similar patterns where the European Stability Mechanism is tightly interconnected with all of the other European institutions, as well as with the International Monetary Fund. Again, we see sort of a geopolitical logic according here, where allied international organizations or organizations dominated by allies are cooperating much more than those controlled by adversaries. So for instance, the Eurasian Fund, which you'll see in the top left of both of these plots, is dominated by Russia, and they have only very rarely pursued cooperation with the International Monetary Fund. Similarly, the two Chinese lending entities, the Chiang Mai Initiative and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which are located at the very top of the plot, neither of them has pursued cooperation with the International Monetary Fund through a co-financing or information sharing deal. In interviews I've conducted, economists from the IMF have told me this is because there's just a lot of friction between institutions when they're led by rivals. And in this situation, we just don't expect cooperation to materialize. And so I show that geopolitical alignment is highly predictive when we're looking at cooperation among international organizations.
So thank you so much for shedding this light on institutional proliferation and cooperation. This is all really interesting research. All right, well, I will let you go, but thank you so much for joining us today. Your research is so fascinating, and I'm just really glad to have the opportunity to share it with my class.
Thanks, Lindsay. Really appreciate the opportunity. This was a lot of fun.
All right, wonderful. Take care.